And they have a big contingent. In fact, their executive secretary is from Wheeling. His name is Michael Tye. There are still ties, T-I-G-H-E. No further comments from me. In Wheeling. And they started debating whether or not. And then they said, no, we can't do it. Why? Get back to that idea that callous to the touches of affection. Just because this guy has money. Could you take money from somebody who did that to our brothers in Pittsburgh? But Pittsburgh has a Carnegie Library. Guess what? Homestead has a huge Carnegie Library. And these guys said no. And they had all these public meetings. And one guy gets up and he said, can't there be just one place in this great green planet where Andrew Carnegie can't buy a monument with his money? And they said, no, we're not going to support it. And the papers just railed against the assembly, railed against labor. They brought in speakers and said, you know, you guys are nuts. You've got to support the library. And they said, it's not that we don't want to support a library. How can we read books in a Carnegie library? That's like asking a Yankee fan to put on a Boston Red Sox hat. Or a Steeler fan to go Browns. You see, Mr. Duffy here, his part of his email address is Stillers75. Okay, because he's a Stiller man. And if I suggested to him that, you know, the Browns are as good as the Steelers, would you believe me? No. Would you support me? No. Would you go and sit in the dog pound in Cleveland? And no. Because there are some things you can't do. Because you have principles. And these Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers had principles, and they said, no, we're not voting for it. And they went around labor communities and said, do not vote for this. Well, they held the vote, and it passed. But not by enough. It passed in every precinct in Wheeling except 3. Webster and Ritchie District. Look at where the steel plants were. Down in that way. And if you looked at where the steel members lived, they lived in Ritchie and Webster districts. And if you looked at the vote by those precincts, rather than supporting the library, they opposed it by a 3-to-1 margin. No library. Now, I have always looked at that and said, you know, if I had been alive at that time, and given the fact that my family was in steel and coal mining, you know, before we ever produced any professors, we were producing coal miners and farmers and steel workers, I would have probably opposed this library too, for that very reason. Because of this callousness that we have about money. And, you know, people would say, well, you know, workers don't care about education. That's not true. If you looked at what the Ohio Valley Trades and Labor Assembly tried to do for its members, you would see that it supported school levies. They supported improvements in the community because they were interested in improving the lifestyle of their workers. We're so centered on workers looking only at hours and wages, we forget that in the 19th century, the majority of American workers lived on the margin of existence. The average American worker at the time this library was shut down was making $600 a year. When my father started working for Weird & Steel in 1942, he made $42 every pay. I remember my mother saying, I thought when your father and I got married, and they got married in July of 1940, when we made $100 a month, we would have it made. And I remember when Alice and I got married in 1967, very, very young, we thought if we could make $1,000 a month, we would have it made. Guess what? Okay, so you see how all that changes. But keep in mind that some of the things that the Ohio Valley Trades and Labor Assembly stood for, 8-hour day, vote for women, immigration restriction, secret ballot. Remember, we still didn't have secret ballots in all places. You had to voice your vote. Okay? Direct election of senators, a graduated income tax. Remember, those are reforms. They're in the vanguard of all of that. Equal pay for women. So these aren't folks who are out to scuttle a library because they're stupid. They're out to scuttle a library because they see the principle. If you take something from that man who has knocked down your brothers in cold blood, then in effect do you forgive him for a crime that is unforgivable? In their minds, that's what they thought. Now, we can all have differences of opinion about that. But that's why when I look at them, I'm thinking, there's the nobility of that cause. There are causes that people go for that aren't about how it will improve their lifestyle, but how it will improve others. One of the things that we'll talk about later in the course is the most important person who ever came out of Wheeling, West Virginia in terms of impact on American society was a labor leader. His name was Walter Reuther. We just put a statue up to him 2 years ago. 2 years ago. And next time you see a picture of the March on Washington in 1963 with Martin Luther King and all of his associates, you'll see a white face coupled down from King. That's Walter Reuther from Wheeling. And at the time that he was marching, the majority of the people in his union opposed civil rights for blacks. But Walter Reuther knew that no, this is what we have to do to improve ourselves. Now, you may not agree that the destruction of a Carnegie library was an improvement, but there's a principle involved. And I see that principle as the one about, are you callous to the touches of affection? And as a consequence, people of Wheeling said, hey, if Carnegie's not going to build it, then we must. And in 1911, they did. And that building is down there on Market Street. 3-story building. It's now called Bennett Square. It was originally only 2 stories. And it was the library until 1976. And then they moved the library up here. This used to be, by the way, a rail yard for the old Hempfield Railway. It came down. Remember the track that used to come down 17th Street? Okay? So we put the library here, and it's no longer the Wheeling Library, it's the Ohio County Public Library. And that's why we have that, because we said no to Carnegie. But if you go to Steubenville, they have a Carnegie Library. East Liverpool has a Carnegie Library. Pittsburgh has all kinds of Carnegie Libraries. There are still 1,400 buildings in the United States that are Carnegie Libraries. This happens not to be one of them. Okay? And I love libraries. I mean,